Logan Hale had spent 12 years learning every sound this factory could make. When the new assembly line began failing without warning, he already knew why. One $12 relay quietly overheating behind a control panel nobody had ever opened. He explained it calmly to the board. The new CEO, Isabella Marsh, laughed in his face. "A $12 fix? Don't be ridiculous," she said, then had him escorted out of the building that same afternoon. 7 months later, after $700,000 disappeared into outside contractors and a desperate engineering overhaul, the machines were still failing exactly as he predicted. Stay until the very end to see how a single $12 part finally humbled a CEO who wasted a fortune. Falcon Motors sat on the edge of a small industrial town in Ohio, the kind of place where the factory whistle still meant something and the parking lot filled with the same trucks every morning at 6. Logan Hale had walked through those gates for 12 years, long enough to know the building the way some men know their own hands, the way a farmer knows weather before the sky changes. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered from years of climbing scaffolding and crawling under conveyor lines, and he carried himself with the quiet patience of a man who had learned that machines, unlike people, always told the truth if you listened closely enough. His wife had passed away when their daughter was barely 3, leaving Logan to build a small, steady life alone in a rented house 2 streets from the elementary school, where mornings began with cereal bowls and quiet routines rather than conversation. He never complained about any of it, not to coworkers, not to neighbors, and certainly not to his daughter, who only ever knew her father as calm, dependable, and endlessly patient with her questions. He was not an engineer by degree, only by instinct, the kind sharpened by thousands of hours spent listening to motors hum and belts stretch and bearings whine just before they failed. The men on the floor called him the one who could diagnose a problem with his eyes closed, simply by standing near a machine and feeling the rhythm change beneath his palm. There had been a winter, years earlier, when an entire stamping press had gone down for 2 days under the official engineering team, only for Logan to find a cracked hydraulic seal within an hour of being called in on his day off, unpaid and unthanked beyond a quiet nod from the shift supervisor. Connor Webb, the floor manager, had relied on him quietly for years, sending him into the worst breakdowns because Logan rarely needed more than an hour to find what 3 engineers couldn't find in a week of meetings and reports. Nobody in the front office knew his name, not really, not beyond a line item on a payroll sheet, somewhere in a folder nobody opened. He existed in the part of the company that kept everything running while the people upstairs argued about quarterly numbers, and that arrangement had suited Logan fine, because it left him enough hours to pick up his daughter from school and still make dinner most nights, usually something simple, usually shared at a small table by a window that looked out onto a quiet street. The town itself had grown up around the factory decades earlier, back when Falcon Motors still bore the name of Isabella's grandfather rather than a corporate logo printed across glass doors. And most families on Logan's Street had at least one relative who had worked the line at some point in their lives. Logan's late wife had grown up 3 blocks from where he now lived, and there were still mornings when he passed the small diner where they had shared their first meal together, the memory arriving softly rather than painfully after all these years apart. He kept a single photograph of her on the kitchen windowsill, faded slightly from years of sunlight, positioned where his daughter could see it each morning without either of them needing to mention it out loud. Evenings in that house followed a rhythm Logan had built carefully over the years, homework spread across the kitchen table while dinner simmered on the stove, the two of them talking about small, ordinary things that mattered far more to him than any recognition he might or might not receive at work. He never once told his daughter how tired the work made him some days, choosing instead to ask about her spelling tests and her friends, believing that a steady, predictable home mattered more than anything happening inside the factory gates. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in early spring when the new assembly line, installed only months earlier at considerable cost, began shutting itself down without warning. At first it seemed minor, a single stoppage that cost 20 minutes of production and earned little more than a frustrated sigh from the shift supervisor. By the end of the week it was happening 3 or 4 times a day, each time for no reason the engineers could explain, each time costing thousands of dollars in lost output and increasingly tense conversations between department heads. The official engineering team, 4 young men with degrees from good universities and very little patience for guesswork, ran diagnostics on the software, checked the robotic arms, recalibrated sensors, and found nothing wrong on paper no matter how many times they repeated the process. Yet the line kept stopping, almost as if it had a mind of its own, almost as if something deeper in the system was lying to everyone watching the screens, and the frustration on the floor began to curdle into something closer to fear, since production quotas tied directly to bonuses that workers depended on to cover rent and groceries each month. One particular afternoon, the line halted mid-cycle just as a batch of finished units sat ready for shipment to a major distributor, and the sudden stop damaged enough of the casing on a dozen units that the entire shipment had to be delayed and partially remade at additional cost. The shift supervisor that day, a younger man new to his position, spent nearly an hour on the phone apologizing to a client representative who made no effort to hide his irritation, a conversation that quietly reached Isabella's desk before sundown. It was a small incident compared to what would follow in the months ahead, but it planted the first seed of real concern in Isabella's mind that this was no longer a minor inconvenience to be solved quietly behind closed doors. Logan noticed the pattern almost immediately, though nobody asked him to look, because noticing patterns had simply become the way his mind worked after 12 years inside the same walls. He noticed that the failures clustered in the afternoon after the machines had been running long enough to build heat, and that the stoppages always traced back to the same section of the control panel, the one tucked behind a junction box that the new engineers rarely opened because the schematics listed it as a low-priority node unworthy of attention. He spent 3 nights after his shift, unpaid and unnoticed, tracing voltage readings with a handheld meter he had bought with his own money years earlier, sitting alone on an overturned crate while the rest of the building sat dark and silent around him. By the 3rd night he found it, a small relay, barely the size of a matchbox, overheating just enough to send a false signal that tricked the safety system into shutting the entire line down before any real damage could occur. It was a $12 part, the kind sold in bulk at any electrical supply store 2 towns over, and it was failing slowly enough that nobody had thought to check it, buried as it was behind wiring far more impressive to look at than to understand. He brought his findings to Connor Webb the next morning, laying out his notes with the same calm he used when explaining anything mechanical, sketches drawn in pencil on the back of a shift schedule because he had never owned anything fancier to write on. Connor was skeptical at first, mostly because the explanation seemed almost embarrassingly simple compared to the chaos it had caused across 3 departments and countless wasted hours. He had worked alongside Logan long enough, though, to trust his instincts more than the engineering degrees hanging on the walls upstairs, degrees that had so far produced nothing but unanswered diagnostic reports. Connor agreed to bring the discovery to the upcoming leadership meeting, the one where the new CEO would finally address the production crisis in front of the full board, a meeting Connor had been dreading for nearly 2 weeks. He told Logan to be ready to explain it clearly, briefly, without the technical detail that tended to lose people who had never held a wrench in their lives. It was, in hindsight, both the right decision and the one that would cost Logan his job that same afternoon. Isabella Marsh had been CEO of Falcon Motors for just under 4 months, having taken the position after her father, the company's founder, stepped back following a sudden health scare that left the entire organization unsettled and uncertain. She was 36, sharp, educated at 2 of the finest business schools in the country, and acutely aware that every member of the board, especially the chairman, David Cole, was watching her decisions with the skepticism reserved for someone who had inherited authority rather than earned it through decades of standing on a factory floor. The production crisis had become the first real test of her leadership, arriving far sooner than she had hoped, and she understood, perhaps too well, that the solution she presented needed to look decisive, modern, and worthy of the title she now held in front of people twice her age. When Connor Webb requested time on the agenda to present a maintenance technician's findings, Isabella agreed mostly out of obligation, expecting a brief technical update before moving on to the outside contractors she had already begun quietly interviewing without telling anyone on the floor. She had spent the previous night rehearsing language for the board about decisive action and modern solutions, language that left little room in her own mind for a $12 answer delivered by a man in a work uniform. The meeting took place in the glass-walled conference room on the top floor, the kind of room Logan had only seen twice in his entire career, both times to deliver paperwork rather than speak. He stood at the head of the table in his work uniform, slightly out of place among tailored suits and polished shoes, and explained the relay calmly, methodically, the way he might explain anything to a curious apprentice standing beside him on the floor. He said the part cost $12 and could be replaced within an hour, that he had already sourced 3 units from a supplier 2 towns over just in case, and that the fix would likely end the stoppages entirely once installed. The room went quiet for a moment, not because the explanation was unconvincing, but because it was almost too simple for the kind of crisis everyone in that room had spent weeks treating as catastrophic and unsolvable. David Cole leaned forward slightly, studying the hand-drawn diagram with something close to genuine interest, while 2 younger board members exchanged a glance that suggested cautious hope rather than dismissal. Isabella looked at the diagrams Logan had drawn by hand, looked at the simple wiring sketch tucked beside complex engineering reports stacked neatly on the table in front of her, and something in her hardened almost instantly. She needed, in that moment, to appear commanding in front of David Cole, who sat at the far end of the table with his arms crossed, waiting to see whether his newest executive could handle pressure without flinching or deferring to someone several pay grades beneath her. A $12 relay suggested by a maintenance worker with no engineering degree did not fit the image of bold modern leadership she had spent 4 months trying to build inside this room. "A $12 fix? Don't be ridiculous," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet, loud enough that nobody dared contradict her or ask a single follow-up question. She turned to Connor and instructed him, in front of everyone, to remove Logan from the floor for overstepping his role and bypassing proper channels. And by that same afternoon, 12 years of service ended with a single envelope and a security escort across a parking lot he had walked through thousands of times before. Within a week, Isabella had hired an outside engineering firm to take full control of the production crisis, eager to demonstrate to the board that she was solving the problem with serious, credentialed expertise rather than guesswork pulled from the factory floor. The firm sent its lead consultant, a confident specialist named Carter Boone, who arrived with a team of analysts, tablets full of diagnostic software, and a manner that suggested he had never once been wrong in his professional life, not even by accident. Carter walked the floor with Isabella at his side, nodding thoughtfully at robotic arms and conveyor belts as though reading a language only he could understand, occasionally pausing to murmur observations into a small recorder clipped to his collar. Within days, he presented a sweeping proposal that included replacing the entire control system, upgrading the software architecture from the ground up, and installing a new generation of safety sensors throughout the line for what he called complete operational certainty. The price tag was steep, well into 6 figures before any labor costs were added, but Isabella approved it almost immediately, relieved to finally have a plan that sounded sophisticated enough to satisfy a board growing impatient with silence. Carter shook her hand afterward and told her, with the easy confidence of a man who had said it many times before, that within 3 weeks this problem would be nothing but a story they told at future meetings. Nobody on Carter's team thought to examine the small relay tucked behind the junction box, the very part Logan had identified weeks earlier, because the official schematics still listed that node as a minor component unworthy of serious attention or testing. The new control system was installed over 3 exhausting weeks, costing nearly $200,000 in equipment, software licensing, and specialized labor flown in from out of state. For a few days it seemed to work, the line running smoothly enough that Isabella allowed herself a small breath of relief during a quiet dinner alone in her apartment, the first calm evening she had experienced in over a month. Then the stoppages returned, this time more erratic than before, sometimes shutting the line down twice within a single hour, sometimes running clean for an entire shift before failing without warning at the worst possible moment. Carter assured Isabella it was simply a software calibration issue, something his team could resolve with additional diagnostic equipment ordered from a specialized supplier on the coast, and he requested another significant sum to bring the new instruments in as quickly as possible. Isabella authorized the spending again, increasingly aware that retreating now would look far worse in front of the board than pressing forward with confidence she no longer fully felt. The new diagnostic equipment arrived after another delay. The testing took nearly 2 additional weeks. And the conclusion Carter's team eventually reached was that the entire wiring harness needed replacement, a project considerably larger and more expensive than anything attempted so far in the crisis. By the time that phase was finished, the total spent on outside contractors had climbed past $400,000, and the line was still stopping with the same maddening unpredictability that had started the entire crisis months earlier, as though mocking every confident proposal placed in front of it. Workers on the floor grew quietly frustrated, watching consultants in pressed shirts walk past machines they barely seemed to understand, occasionally asking questions that made veteran technicians exchange tired glances behind their backs. One older machinist, a man named Walter who had worked the line for almost 20 years, muttered to a coworker one afternoon that the answer was probably something small they had all walked past 100 times, though neither of them knew at the time how close that remark had landed to the truth. David Cole visited the facility once during this stretch, unannounced, and found Carter Boone presenting yet another revised timeline to a small group of managers near the loading dock. He asked Carter directly, without softening the question, why none of the diagnostic work had ever included a simple physical inspection of the original components flagged before the contract began. Carter answered smoothly, the way he answered everything, explaining that legacy components were typically ruled out early in any serious engineering review because modern failures usually originated in software rather than in decades-old hardware design. David said nothing in response beyond a slow nod, though something in his expression suggested he found the answer less satisfying than Carter clearly intended it to sound. He left the facility that afternoon without another word. But the visit was enough to make Isabella aware, for the first time, that the chairman's patience was beginning to run on a much shorter clock than her own. Grace Tully, a quality control technician who had worked alongside Logan for almost a decade, watched the entire situation unfold with a growing sense of disbelief that she kept carefully hidden behind a calm, professional expression. She remembered clearly the morning Logan had explained his findings to her in the break room weeks before any of this began, sketching the relay on a paper napkin with the same calm confidence he brought to every diagnosis he had ever made. She kept his explanation in the back of her mind through each failed attempt by the outside firm, through each new round of expensive equipment arriving on pallets at the loading dock, through every meeting where Isabella reassured the board that a permanent solution was close at hand. Grace was careful, though, knowing that mentioning Logan's name too loudly might cost her own position, especially after watching how quickly and publicly the CEO had dismissed him that first afternoon in the glass-walled conference room. She found herself, more than once, standing near the junction box during her rounds, staring at the section of panel Logan had once pointed to, fighting the urge to say something to anyone who might actually listen. The financial pressure on Isabella intensified as the weeks turned into months, and the crisis began reaching far beyond the factory floor into territory she had never expected to navigate so early in her tenure. One of Falcon Motors' largest clients, a regional distributor responsible for nearly a third of the company's annual revenue, sent a formal warning letter threatening to cancel its contract entirely if delivery delays continued past the next quarter. Industry publications picked up on the story shortly after, framing it as a cautionary tale about a young CEO struggling under the weight of a role she had inherited rather than earned through years on a production floor, language that stung Isabella far more than she allowed anyone around her to see. David Cole called an emergency board session on a humid afternoon in midsummer, his patience visibly thinning around the edges of an otherwise composed expression, reminding Isabella in front of the other directors that nearly $700,000 had now been spent without resolving a single root cause of the original failure. He gave her 30 days to fix the problem permanently, his voice calm but unmistakably final, warning that her position depended entirely on what happened within that window of time. Two directors who had supported her appointment months earlier said nothing during the meeting, their silence somehow louder than any objection could have been. One of them, an older woman named Margaret who had sat on the board since the company's earliest years, stopped Isabella briefly in the hallway afterward, away from the others. She said only that numbers could always be explained to shareholders eventually, but trust, once spent carelessly, rarely returned at the same exchange rate. Isabella thanked her for the remark, though she walked the rest of the way to the elevator turning the words over slowly, uncertain whether she had just been comforted or quietly warned. Isabella left that meeting shaken in a way she rarely allowed herself to be, sitting alone in her office long after the building had emptied for the evening, the city lights outside her window, doing little to settle the tightness in her chest. She replayed the numbers in her head, $700,000 spent, a major client threatening to leave, her own authority hanging by a thread in front of a board that had never fully trusted her judgment to begin with. Somewhere beneath the frustration, a smaller and more uncomfortable thought kept resurfacing, one she tried to push away each time it appeared uninvited. She remembered a maintenance worker standing calmly at the head of a conference table, holding up a hand-drawn diagram of a part that cost less than the lunch she had eaten that same day, watching the way he never once raised his voice, even as she dismissed him in front of everyone. She told herself the timing had simply been wrong, that a problem this large could never have had a solution that simple, yet the thought refused to leave her entirely, returning each night in the quiet hour before sleep finally arrived. She thought, too, about her father, recovering slowly in a house across town, and wondered what he would have done in her position all those months earlier. He had built this company from a single rented garage decades before glass conference rooms and outside consultants existed anywhere in its history. And he had always told her, back when she was a girl trailing behind him on factory tours, that the people who actually touched the machines usually knew more than anyone sitting behind a desk. She had nodded along as a child without truly understanding what he meant, and only now, sitting alone with the weight of $700,000 pressing on her chest, did the lesson finally arrive with any real force. It was not a comfortable thought, but it was an honest one, and Isabella allowed herself, for the first time in months, to sit with it rather than push it away. While the crisis consumed Falcon motors from the inside out, Logan had quietly rebuilt a smaller version of his old routine, the kind built around necessity rather than ambition. He took on odd repair jobs around town, fixing appliances and small engines for neighbors who paid what they could afford, sometimes cash, sometimes a few jars of homemade preserves left on his porch as thanks, enough together to keep the lights on and his daughter fed without complaint. He never spoke badly about the company to anyone, not even when old coworkers stopped by the house to share rumors about the chaos still unfolding inside the factory he once knew so well, rumors that grew stranger and more expensive with each passing month. His daughter noticed only that her father seemed a little more tired in the evenings, a little quieter while doing dishes after dinner, though he always made sure to ask about her school day before anything else and never once let the worry show in front of her. He kept his old toolbox by the back door, cleaned and organized exactly as it had always been, as though some part of him understood that the story was not yet finished. One evening, while drying dishes together after dinner, his daughter asked him plainly why he no longer went to the big factory anymore, the one with the loud machines she had visited once on a school trip years earlier. Logan considered the question carefully before answering, the way he considered most things, and told her simply that sometimes grown-ups make decisions that are not fair, but that being right quietly was usually better than being loud about it. She seemed satisfied with that answer in the easy way children accept truths they do not yet fully understand, returning her attention to a half-finished glass of milk on the counter. Logan smiled faintly at that, grateful in a way he could not quite explain that his daughter's world remained small and steady even while his own had grown complicated in ways she never needed to carry. Grace Tully finally decided she could not stay silent any longer, especially after overhearing two executives near the break room discussing the possibility of shutting the new line down entirely if the next round of repairs failed to produce results within the month. She found Logan's number through a mutual friend from church and called him on a quiet Sunday evening, her voice slightly unsteady as she explained everything that had happened since his dismissal, the outside contractors, the failed upgrades, the staggering total now approaching $700,000 spent chasing a ghost. Logan listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, sitting at his kitchen table with the phone pressed to his ear while his daughter colored quietly nearby. When Grace finished, he simply said that the relay was likely still the problem, since nothing she described suggested anyone had actually located and replaced it during all those weeks of testing. Grace asked, somewhat hesitantly, whether he would be willing to come back if given the chance, and Logan paused only long enough to glance toward his daughter's bedroom door before answering quietly that he would, if asked properly this time, with no conditions attached beyond simple respect. Connor Webb, watching the company's reputation and his own department crumble under the weight of unresolved failures, finally found the courage to raise Logan's name directly with Isabella during a private meeting in her office. He chose his words carefully, framing it not as a contradiction of her earlier decision but as a practical low-cost option worth eliminating before the 30-day deadline expired, something any responsible leader would consider given the circumstances. Isabella resisted at first, the memory of that conference room still sharp and uncomfortable in her mind, unwilling to admit that bringing back the very person she had dismissed so publicly might be her only remaining option. Yet as the deadline closed in and Carter Boone's team requested yet another expensive round of testing equipment, this time citing the need for thermal imaging cameras imported from overseas, her resistance finally gave way to something closer to quiet desperation. She told Connor in a voice far quieter than the one she had used months earlier in that glass-walled room, to call Logan and ask him to return for a single day, framed only as a routine consultation rather than any kind of admission of fault. Logan arrived at the factory early on a gray Thursday morning, wearing the same simple work uniform he had worn for 12 years, carrying a small toolbox and the same quiet composure that had defined him long before any of this began. Connor met him at the gate, visibly relieved, shaking his hand a little longer than usual before walking him directly to the section of the line still causing trouble, careful to avoid mentioning the hundreds of thousands of dollars already spent trying to solve what Logan had identified for free months earlier. Word had already begun moving through the floor by the time they reached the control panel, workers pausing their tasks just long enough to watch, some of them whispering to each other about the man who had once been escorted out for saying exactly what everyone now wished someone had listened to. Logan opened the junction box without hesitation, located the same overheating relay he had diagnosed before, and held it up for Connor to see, the metal casing slightly discolored from months of repeated strain and heat. He replaced it with a new unit from his toolbox, the kind any electrical supply store carried for around $12, working with the calm efficiency of a man performing a task he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his mind. The entire procedure took less than 15 minutes from start to finish, quieter and less dramatic than anything the expensive consultants had attempted over the previous 7 months. Connor watched in silence, his arms folded, shaking his head slowly at the simplicity of it all after everything the company had endured to arrive at the same conclusion. 7 months, he said quietly, almost to himself, and it took you 15 minutes. Logan only shrugged, closing the panel back into place with the same unhurried care he gave to everything, and said that the part had never been complicated, only overlooked. He wiped his hands on a rag from his back pocket and stepped back from the panel, watching the line the way a man watches weather, waiting to see if it would hold. Word spread through the floor almost instantly, and by the time the line restarted, a small crowd had gathered near the control panel, drawn by curiosity and the quiet hope that the nightmare might finally be ending after so many false starts. The conveyor system hummed back to life smoothly, the robotic arms moving in steady, uninterrupted rhythm, and the safety system remained silent for the first time in months, no warning lights, no sudden halts, nothing but the steady mechanical pulse of a line finally working as intended. Isabella arrived on the floor just as the line completed its first full cycle without incident, having been informed only that Logan was on site for a brief consultation, not expecting to witness the resolution firsthand or this quickly. She stood at the edge of the crowd, watching machines run cleanly for the first time since the crisis began, and felt the weight of 7 months and $700,000 settle uncomfortably across her shoulders like something physical pressing down on her chest. Workers around her began murmuring quietly to one another, some smiling, some simply relieved, none of them quite meeting her eyes, though nobody said anything directly to her about what the moment so clearly revealed. David Cole happened to be touring the facility that same afternoon, part of his ongoing oversight following the 30-day ultimatum, and he arrived just in time to see the line operating without interruption for nearly 2 consecutive hours, longer than it had managed in months. He asked, with the directness that had made him chairman in the first place, exactly what had been done to resolve the issue, his eyes moving slowly across the faces gathered near the control panel. Connor, unwilling to soften the truth any further after everything he had witnessed over the past 7 months, explained plainly that a maintenance technician had replaced a small relay identical to the one identified months earlier before his dismissal from the company. The silence that followed was heavier than anything Isabella had experienced in any boardroom, heavier even than the meeting where her authority had first been openly threatened in front of her peers. David turned to her, his expression unreadable, neither angry nor pleased, simply waiting, and asked only one quiet question. How much had the company spent reaching the same conclusion this man had offered for free almost a year earlier? Isabella did not answer immediately, partly because the number felt almost unbearable to say aloud in front of the very person whose dismissal had set everything in motion months ago. She finally admitted the figure, nearly $700,000 across outside contractors, equipment and testing, and watched David's jaw tighten slightly as he absorbed the full weight of it standing there on the factory floor. Rather than retreating into excuses or deflecting blame onto the consultants, something she might easily have done months earlier in this same position, Isabella turned instead toward Logan, who stood quietly near the control panel, closing his toolbox as though nothing unusual had happened at all. She walked toward him directly, in front of Connor, David, and the small crowd of workers still lingering nearby, and said, simply and clearly, that she had been wrong to dismiss him the way she had, and wrong to dismiss what he knew long before she ever understood the cost of that mistake. Her voice did not waver, though her hands clasped tightly in front of her told a different story to anyone paying close attention. Logan accepted the apology with the same calm he carried into everything, neither gloating nor performing humility he didn't feel, simply nodding once and saying that he only wanted the chance to do his job properly, with the recognition it had always deserved from the very beginning. Isabella, perhaps for the first time since taking the role, allowed herself to be honest in front of the board chairman rather than defensive, admitting quietly that her decision months earlier had been driven more by image and fear than by sound judgment. She offered Logan his position back immediately, along with a newly created role overseeing maintenance diagnostics company-wide, a title that finally matched the expertise he had quietly carried for over a decade without recognition. Logan accepted, not out of triumph or any desire to prove a point, but because the offer felt like simple fairness finally arriving, later than it should have but honest all the same. David Cole shook Logan's hand before leaving the floor that afternoon, a small gesture that carried more weight inside that building than any formal announcement could have managed. In the weeks that followed, Falcon Motors quietly closed its contract with the outside engineering firm, the official explanation citing internal restructuring rather than admitting the full truth to the wider industry watching from a careful distance. Carter Boone moved on to another client without ever acknowledging the relay publicly, his confidence intact despite the outcome, the kind of confidence that rarely seemed to suffer no matter how a project ended. Connor Webb found himself trusted more deeply than ever by both the floor workers and the executives above him. His earlier willingness to speak up for Logan quietly remembered by people who mattered more than he realized at the time. Grace Tully received quiet recognition for her role in finally connecting Logan back to the company, and the two of them often shared a brief, knowing smile whenever the topic of the crisis came up in casual conversation near the break room. She kept the old paper napkin sketch Logan had once drawn for her folded inside a kitchen drawer at home, a small private memento of the night she finally decided silence was no longer worth the cost. Connor, for his part, made a quiet habit afterward of checking in personally with floor technicians before escalating any new problem upward, a small shift in instinct that prevented several smaller issues from ever growing into anything resembling the crisis that came before. Isabella, for her part, began visiting the production floor more often than any CEO before her, listening more than she spoke, gradually earning a kind of respect from the workers that her title alone had never been able to provide on its own. Logan's life changed only modestly on the surface, though the difference mattered enormously to him in ways that were hard to put into words even to himself. He still walked through the same gates every morning, still listened to machines the way other people listened to music, but now his insight carried the weight it always deserved, recognized rather than dismissed by people who once walked past him without a second glance. His daughter noticed, in the simple way children notice such things, that her father seemed lighter in the evenings, more willing to laugh at small jokes during dinner, more present during the quiet hours after homework was finished and dishes were cleared away. Isabella occasionally stopped by his section of the floor, not out of obligation but out of something closer to genuine curiosity, asking questions she once would have considered beneath her position, listening carefully to his answers in a way she rarely had before everything that happened. She kept a small framed copy of his original hand-drawn diagram in her office afterward, not as a trophy but as a quiet reminder of the cost of looking away from simple truths. Nothing between them ever became more than mutual respect carried in small, quiet gestures, an occasional nod across the floor, a brief exchange about a new piece of equipment, nothing rushed or declared beyond what either of them was ready to acknowledge. Yet something had shifted permanently in how the company operated, in how Isabella led, and in how Logan's quiet expertise was treated by everyone who once overlooked it without a second thought. New hires in the engineering department were quietly encouraged, in their first week, to spend time walking the floor with veteran technicians before touching a single diagnostic tablet. A small policy change nobody publicized but everyone on the floor noticed and appreciated. Carter Boone's firm was never mentioned again in any internal meeting, his name fading quickly from a company that had once treated his arrival as a turning point worth celebrating. Even Walter, the older machinist who had once muttered his quiet suspicion about something small being overlooked, found himself occasionally asked his opinion in meetings he would never have been invited to a year earlier. The $12 relay remained, in a strange and almost humbling way, the most expensive lesson Falcon Motors ever learned, a small piece of metal that cost the company nearly $700,000 to rediscover and cost one calm, steady man nothing at all to find in the first place. By the time autumn arrived, the assembly line ran without a single unexplained stoppage, the client letter long since withdrawn. The board's earlier tension quietly dissolved into something far closer to renewed confidence in Isabella's steady, hard-won judgment. She kept that small frame diagram on her desk through every season that followed, a quiet correction against the temptation to ever again mistake simplicity for foolishness, a reminder she found herself glancing toward more often than she ever expected to in her first difficult year leading the company her father had built. And Logan Hale walked home each evening the same way he always had, unhurried, unbothered, his daughter's small hands sometimes finding his along the familiar sidewalk, quietly certain that some truths, however small, were always worth waiting for.